Garance, do you come to Europe much? I guess so. You would come to France at least.
Yes, we are live, so
Thank you. Okay.
Yes, every year I spend time. Okay, so hello and welcome to our VDEV CEPR bread seminar. We're very happy to welcome Sonia Bhalotra from Warwick as our speaker today. So just a quick reminder of the basic mechanism of the seminar. It will run for an hour. The last 15 minutes will be Q&A at the end. I'll open the mic for selected participants to ask their question live. If you have questions during the talk, please write them in the Q&A section. Sonia Bhalotra is going to answer the questions, and I'll pick some that I think everybody would benefit to ask Sonia during the talk. Naturally, no abusive behavior will be tolerated in the space, and otherwise, that's it. So I'm going to give the mic to Sonia for her seminar. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to all of the organizing committee for inviting me and to everyone present for attending. So I'm going to present joint work with Medha and Dakshu are students. Dakshu's here, he's studying in Oxford now, and Genicot, who's at Ashoka as an associate professor. I'm going to dive straight in. So workplace sexual harassment is reported to have affected at least a half of all women in OECD countries. And recent research documents what look to be causal effects of sexual harassment on the careers of women, on firms, and on the economy. But policies to handle sexual harassment are typically voluntary. They're chosen by firms, sort of individually styled, and typically involve training and grievance type procedures. And there's a recent book, or a book and a paper by Dobbin and Kelly, who are at Harvard, they're sociologists, which does analysis of the US record over about 30 years and concludes that these policies are a complete failure. There is, I have another slide which I've sort of hidden for time, but just briefly, let me say that in the UK and the US, so in the US you probably are more familiar with, there's the Equal Opportunities Commission.
You have not shared your slides, huh?
Oh, I haven't. Oh.
No.
Sorry, I thought they were shared from the start. Let me do it now. Is that showing now?
Yes.
Okay, so those are my co-authors. That's the paper title. And this is just the few words I spoke about the prevalence and the harm, and the fact that the existing policy framework is largely driven by voluntary firm policies that offer training and grievance procedures. But the record of these policies is poor. And let me just say in the UK and the US, and I guess it's similar elsewhere, sexual harassment falls under equalities commissions, which sometimes don't have enforcement powers. So you can complain to a sort of national board about discrimination at the workplace, and sexual harassment would fall under gender discrimination. But that sort of report doesn't have a lot of bite. So what we do in this paper is investigate the passage in 2013 of the Prevention of Sexual Harassment Act in India, abbreviated POSH. POSH required all firms with more than 10 workers to set up an internal complaints committee, now an ICC, and also to train workers in recognizing sexual harassment and its potential consequences. India is not alone. Broadly similar legislation has been passed in France, Brazil, the Philippines, Pakistan, and this is just our own manual research. It may not be comprehensive. The reason that a policy like POSH is interesting is that it marks a significant departure from the status quo of firm-led policies in two respects. First, it harmonizes policy across firms, and second, it makes firms accountable. There hasn't been an evaluation of this policy. It's firstly because it's difficult to evaluate it with respect to its primary target, which is sexual harassment, because there are simply no systematic data. There's actually just no data before the policy. The policy included a provision that firms should report in their annual reports cases brought to them and cases resolved. So after the policy, compliant firms are producing some statistics, but they haven't been compiled into one database. But in any case, there's no pre-policy. In the post period, you do see an increase in the number of cases, suggesting that there is some improvement in reporting. So what we do in this paper is to look at how firms react to the policy and whether the accountability, which imposes costs on firms, leads them to make adjustments at other margins. So what we focus on is the impact of POSH on the gender composition and the size of firms. Just now, quickly, a brief theoretical framework for what we'd expect. So we expect that firms subject to the law, at least in the short term, and especially smaller firms for whom any fixed costs are harder to accommodate, will be more reluctant to hire women. Notice that every woman adds a potential cost to the firm in terms of the risk of a report. Firms near the threshold may also adjust their size, not just their gender composition, to avoid being subject to the law, to avoid compliance altogether. In the longer term, if POSH were successful in deterring sexual harassment, then we might expect that reduced workplace frictions will increase worker productivity, and that this will deter size manipulation and lower any policy-driven reluctance to hire women. Also, over a longer term, women may be more likely to participate given safer environments, and they'll sort into the regulated firms. We are working towards a model where we hope we'll be more sort of clear on specific predictions. But what I take away from here is essentially we expect that small firms might reduce their demand for women. This work relates to a literature on firm responses to policies that are protective of a target group of workers. I think the most natural comparator is maternity leave policies, but there's also equal pay laws, pay transparency laws, minimum wage laws, all of which affect one group and change the incentives of the firm to possibly to hire that group. There's a separate literature on strategic bunching around policy thresholds, the literature on kinks and notches, and a small part of this literature has looked at firm size contingent policies. So we're aware of these two papers I named. Garance et al. Look at the French system where many policies kick in at size 50, and Amirapu and Gector build on Garance and present results for India. Both of these papers are estimating the distortions to the economy flowing from size contingent policies that lead to sort of suboptimal behaviors that are driven by evasion incentives. So our setting is a bit more complex, which is why we haven't immediately implemented a similar approach. These models model firm size, whereas we model firm size and composition. They're static, they use cross-sectional data, and we are interested in a policy change, and they don't discuss the supply side. So our main results, so we do find a decline in the share of women in the smaller regulated firms. This decline is larger and only statistically significant in both occupations and firms that before the policy had a below median baseline share of women. So I think I could speculate further, but my proposal for why is that where a firm had a low share of women at baseline, that's reflecting, I think, a technology, but I couldn't rule out that it's reflecting norms. So it's reflecting either technology or norms. And if those firms could do without women beforehand, then after the policy, they may be more able and willing to let go of women. But the upshot of this is that the policy intensified gender segregation in the workplace. And if there's one established risk factor for sexual harassment, it's the share of men in the workplace. So there are studies from Sweden, France, and we looked at data ourselves from Brazil. And in all of these countries, one thing that really sticks out in predicting whether a firm had sexual harassment cases is the share of men. Clearly, if the share of men went to 100, there would be no cases. And if it was 0, there would be no cases. But it does up to some point, which in a really simple model is 50, I believe. But up to a point, it is increasing in the share of men. The second implication of our finding is that women become more likely, since they're not hired in regulated firms after the policy, or they're hired at a lower rate, they become more likely to work in smaller, unregulated firms. And these smaller firms have lower wages, limited job protection, and few amenities. So, for example, the smaller firms have no maternity leave. And our third finding, although it's imprecise, we think it's informative of the underlying mechanisms, is there is an imprecise tendency for the share of women in the firm to increase in the larger, regulated firms, where protection against sexual harassment is stronger. In general, larger firms have better amenities, so that's consistent with that. And so it appears that POSH leads to female employment hollowing out in the middle. So women are pushed into smaller, unregulated firms and into the larger, well-regulated firms. But the middle in India is quite significant, quite big. I'll show you the distribution as we move on. We do find some distortion in the firm size distribution. Its magnitude appears small, but it appears to be the sort of distortion that is consistent with some manipulation to avoid the policy. So there's some bunching on the left of the threshold. And the implication of this in broader terms is that it's a potential drag on aggregate productivity. So let me tell you briefly about the law, the Act. Is the chat in? Okay. So the mandate requires that all workplaces with at least 10 employees create an ICC, a complaints committee. This committee needs to resolve queries, or at least come back on queries, within 90 days, and it's empowered to issue consequences. So it must contain 4 members, a senior female as chairperson, and 1 remunerated external member. POSH also requires that the firm does this training to sensitize all employees. In fact, India has seen a sort of emergence of HR firms that specialize in providing this training. Workers need to be made aware of the penal consequences of perpetration, and firms need to report the number of cases filed and disposed of under the Act. If a firm is deemed to be non-compliant, it can be fined, and the fine can extend to about $500. If the employer is repeatedly convicted for non-compliance, then twice the first punishment can ensue, or the business could lose its license. So the risks the firm faces, I think, are for small firms quite substantial. There's not so much it's likely not so much the cost of creating the committee, which boils down to the time of 3 incumbent members and 1 remunerated external who meet when there's a case. Some effort and money spent on training. It's, I think, primarily the risk the firm faces of receiving a case and that case not being appropriately resolved. And so its reputation is at stake, but if the firm was seen as not acting appropriately, then it's also subject to this fine. So yeah, here I am saying what I was saying earlier, that broadly SH is regarded as a form of gender-based discrimination regulated by an equalities watchdog. In most countries, in its milder forms, it's not criminalized. And so cases are actually brought against firms and not the often male perpetrators. I should also just clarify that in India, the law is specific that victims covered by the law are women. So if there was perpetration against, if there was sexual harassment with male victims, it's not covered by the law. So I think I've said all this.
A couple of clarifying questions. One is that are there other policies in India that apply to firms with less than 10? And another one is what's the link between the committee and the complaints? Does the committee have any power to force the firm to act?
Yeah, both very good questions. So lots of policies. So India is like France, except in France the cutoff is 50. In India it's 10. Many policies kick in at size 10, but because we're going to do a DID, I will come to this. We're going to hope that we difference out any pre-existing differences at size 10. And the second question, yes, the committee very much has the power to force the firm to act. So in my reading, I've read around the literature and also some of the non-economics literature. The policy design in India sounds really impressive to me. I think it's a good design. One thing, as we're talking about design, one thing I find odd about it is that the policy is not scaled to firm size. So, for example, the fines are not adjusted for the size of the firm. They're just, if there's one case and you're in trouble, then you're fined. So it's just a policy that really hits smaller firms. I mean, when I say small, I mean, you're regulated at size 10, but if you're size 200, you're going to be able to accommodate the policy more easily than if you're size 12. I think what percentage of relevant firms have been fined? We don't have this data. We are thinking of trying to make a bigger effort in scraping what we can find. There is no, but we should try harder to find something. So should I carry on?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. So this policy is seen as one that encourages reporting and redressal. So thinking back to the sort of conceptual framework, what we expect, what are the underlying mechanisms, the policy lowers the cost of reporting, which should encourage reporting, but it also increases redressal, which should deter incidents. So it should do both things. It should deter incidents, and conditional on incidents, it should encourage reporting. Okay. So our empirical strategy. We use the fact that there's this discontinuity in coverage of the law at firm size 10 in a difference in difference design. We define a firm as regulated if before POSH it had at least 10 employees, because of course, after POSH, firm size changes because of growth, but it also changes possibly because of manipulation. So regulation is defined on the pre-policy size. And so the estimates are an intent to treat. The natural threats to identification in any such sort of DID policy are I'm just trying to make this fit the screen, that the outcomes of the treated and controlled, which are in this case the regulated and the unregulated firms, may have been diverging before POSH, This isn't implausible because of the point you raised, which is that many other laws kick in at size 10. To manage this, we restrict firm size to a sort of narrower window. It goes up to 500 and more, to 1 to 25 workers. So it's sort of approximating RD. I'm going to talk about RD on the next page. And then we estimate an event study and test for differential pre-trends. We also implement a regression in discontinuities estimator, and it produces similar results. So I'm not seeing the, here. The second, so the first concern is the possibly previously divergent trends. The second concern, this is generic to any DID, is unobserved shocks coincident with the policy that strike regulated and unregulated firms differently. So there is one such shock, which is that a pre-existing Maternity Benefits Act was extended in 2017. And we deal with it quite crudely by right truncating the data at 2016. But we also provide results in an appendix where we don't truncate the data. We include region times year and industry times year fixed effects, which absorb impacts of state-specific and industry-specific legislative changes or economic shocks. A few words on strategic manipulation and how this impacts upon our strategy. So we don't use the RD around size 10 because of the potential manipulation of firm size. Instead, we address firm size manipulation by using a donut DID. We remove firms close to the threshold, as these are the ones that have an incentive to manipulate size. And this requires deciding how big the donut is. So we vary the size of the donut. We also vary it symmetrically and show you results when we drop the left or we drop the right. And the results are actually really stable. We then also do something dirty, which is to split the sample on endogenous switching and study the behavior of switchers versus non-switchers. So we know whether, so the question we're trying to answer is those firms that say shrink from a size of 10, 11, 12 to a size of 8 or 9. Are they shrinking by getting rid of women, by firing women? In which case they're simultaneously adjusting size and composition. And what are the non-switchers doing? So the answer to that is yes, they are essentially, I can tell you now that the switchers are lowering size and at the same time disproportionately firing women. They're also firing men. And they do that, I think, because there just aren't enough women. So female share is quite low at baseline. So they fire men and women, but they fire more women. And the other thing to say is, in general, when we see the share of women in employment decline, what's happening is that firms in India in this period are growing. And when they grow, they're hiring men at a faster rate than women. So it's not so much, on average, it's not so much firing, but differential hiring. So just to remind you where I was, this is empirical strategy. And I was saying what implications potential strategic manipulation of firm size has for our strategy. And it is that we use the donut DID. And this is our forward plan to build upon these studies I've mentioned before that look at size manipulation, but in a cross-section, and develop that approach to our panel setting so that what we'll come out with is an estimate of the costs of that distortion. So the data we use is from 3 complementary sources. For those of you who know the Indian data, I'll throw in the acronyms, but you don't need to know the data. So India has a household survey that's been running since the 60s called the National Sample Survey. widely used by researchers. And this is a set of repeated cross-sections. It has the advantage that it's representative. Gosh, I'm doing quite badly on time. Better hurry up. I've just seen the time. Okay, so I won't belabor this. I think when I discuss the estimation, a lot of this will be clear. We use a household survey because it's representative, and we basically have individuals across all sectors. We then narrow down to the manufacturing sector, but leverage the fact that the firm data set for manufacturing is a panel. That's quite useful. But it also has a weakness, which is that there's incomplete coverage of the smaller firms by the nature of requirements to register in the firm panel. So we use a national sample survey of unregulated firms to try and improve the coverage problem. So we start with the survey because it sort of leaves nothing out. Here we define the individual outcome, Y, which is employment. For person I in states, and there's also district, state S, district D, industry J, the dummy is essentially 1 if the employee is a woman and 0 if the employee is a man. So we're taking the set of employed individuals, and we have to do this because your firm size is only defined if you're employed. So this is a household survey which is asking, are you employed? If you're employed, which sector and so on do you work in industry? And then what is the size of your establishment or your workplace? Whenever I say firm in this talk, I actually mean establishment. I'm sorry, I should say establishment. It's the physical unit. And the law applies to the physical unit, not to the ownership unit. So we know, so what we're trying to find out here is whether individuals who are employed and are allocated across firms of size 10 and higher or 9 and lower are after the policy more likely to be male or female. So we have fixed effects for industry and district here. I won't read these, but you see the what's relevant for context is the proportion of female workers employed is about 17% on average. And it's not so different between these two groups. This is the sort of main result. You see that we have only one post period. This is a weakness. And it's because we lop off the data after the maternity reform, and also because the NSS is not every year. So I'm avoiding data details that I think are not interesting in a shortish time. But this weakness that we observe only one post period is addressed when we look at the manufacturing sector. We have more periods. So this is the DID equivalent of that event study. The dependent variable is 1 if female. And you see in the first row that after the policy, women are less likely to be employed in firms of size 10 or higher, and by construction, more likely to be employed in smaller firms. And notice that the base coefficient is positive. So in general, female employment in the sector is rising. But after the policy, there's a shift against that trend. And this result is, I'd say, quite clearly robust across columns to all these different controls. Now, just to kind of unpack the DID, I think it's always worth looking at the two parts of the DID. There we had regulated versus unregulated, which you can think of as bigger than 10 or smaller than 10 firms, size 10. Post-policy, pre-policy. Now we look at the first difference, which is whether you're a male or a female in regulated and unregulated firms separately. And we see that in both sets of firms, the share of women is actually rising, but it's rising faster in unregulated firms. So the regulated firms are responding and hiring men in preference to women. This is the other single difference, where we're looking essentially at whether after the policy, the employment rate of men, so we see that the employment rate of men is rising. This is actually just a trend. And for women, it's falling. So these are not well identified because they're single differences, but they tell you what the underlying variation is. Because I'm hoping to move on to the firm data and to firm size manipulation, I'm going to start speaking quickly, but I'm not looking at the chat, but my co-authors are there. So please stop me if I am now going to talk quickly enough that I become unclear. So this is the survey data again, but we're now looking at heterogeneity by a number of occupational and worker characteristics. I point you to this green bar here, and I'm going to summarize the results. This is by sector, by regional characteristics. So what we have is whether the occupation had a high or low share of women, the female-male wage ratio, the education and age of the worker, whether the state the worker worked in was in the north or south, whether the state had crime against women below above median, which is a marker of gender norms. So I'm not reading everything, also corruption. Let me explain here what the big patterns are. No, sorry, these slides are too big for the screen, so I'm losing. Okay, here's my summary. So female share declines significantly more and only in occupations and industries with a lower initial share of women. The declines are larger amongst younger and more educated women and in regions with higher male unemployment and regressive norms. Now, this just sounds like a list when I read it out, but these axes of heterogeneity are informative of the model or the underlying mechanisms. So, for example, the reason that we suspect that higher male unemployment makes a difference is that it makes it easier to substitute female with male workers. Or the reason that regressive norms matter is possibly that the firm is not really willing to think of the long-term positive effects of having the sexual harassment policy in place. So where I could say a lot more is about these mechanisms, and the reason I'm not doing it is only that I think it's going to sound speculative because we haven't actually formalized a model with firm predictions, but I think some of these are quite intuitive. Some could actually go the other way. So for example, the regressive norms, that could go the other way. If you were in a progressive region, gender progressive region, you could imagine that more women would bring cases, and so the firm would be more reluctant to hire women because women are progressive. So that one could go in either direction. Corruption could also go in either direction because corruption could, if there's high corruption, that could mean you have to pay the organs of the state a larger bribe, which is a cost. But you could also imagine that if there's high corruption, then you could get away with the policy. So I hate to sort of say it could be this and it could be that, which is why I'm not elaborating this very much. But it's very much on our agenda to try and formalize model with some predictions that then gives more structure to the heterogeneous effects. So we did some robustness checks, looking at the time. I think nothing important to say here. Let me move on now to the work with the firm panel. We now restrict to just manufacturing, but we have a panel, so we can look at a firm that was size 8, 9, 10, 11 before the policy and see what happens to their composition and their size after the policy. So we have firm fixed effects in there in some of the other fixed effects we've discussed before. I've mentioned this before, the coverage of smaller firms is incomplete. This is a picture of that data set. So it is not a picture of the Indian economy, but in our data set, 30% of firms fall under the size threshold of 10. In the economy as a whole, it's a much larger fraction. So India has a predominance of small firms. The share of women in this sector ranges from about 8 to 18% and is increasing in firm size. I'm sorry these aren't so clear, but you're on screen, so you can see the main outcome is the first one, the percent of female workers. Now we have 4 periods after the policy, and the decline is continuing. There is also a decline at the extensive margin, which is whether there's at least one woman in the firm. When we break down the share of women into the number of female workers and the number of male workers, you can see here evidence that the number of females is actually falling and the number of males is rising. So what I said earlier about both rising was for all sectors. In manufacturing, it seems that the number of female workers is falling. And I didn't explain the strategy. I'm sorry, I'm trying to rush now. But it's essentially a DID with regulated times post. And this is the regression equivalent of those slides, where the percentage of female workers is significantly falling and the other outcomes are in the direction we expect, but are underpowered. This is the donut specification, where we've removed firms size 8 to 12 around that threshold of size 10. And the results are, if at all, marginally larger. Let me show you a continuous donut here. So now we have, this is a coefficient plot where every coefficient and whisker is from a different regression. The baseline model is the first coefficient here. And then the donut increases in increments from 9 to 11 to 8 to 12 and so on. And it also, yes, basically it increases from 9 to 11 right up to 4 to 16. And you see that the results are really quite stable up till a removal of size 6 to 14. And then if at all, they become larger. We have actually thought about why they become larger, but the differences are not significant. And so I, again, won't hold you there. We've got these left-sided donut specifications and right-sided donut, just so we can think more. Oh, sorry, my screen is just too small for the hyperlinks. Okay, let me move on because I do want to show you manipulation. The right-sided donut. What this shows you is that once you start to remove firms to the right, so you drop firms 10 and 11, and the yellow bar on the right-hand side, you've dropped firms 10 to 16. The coefficient estimate is almost insensitive, so it's very stable to dropping firms on the right, which suggests that the behavior of firms in what we see is actually not restricted to firms around 10 to 11, because even when we drop those, we get results. So firms as large as size 17 are reacting to the policy. And the way I think about that is that they're reacting because not because they're trying to become non-compliant, but because they see every woman as a risk of a case. Like we did with the survey data, we show you the single differences with the firm data. Here, what you observe is in regulated and unregulated firms, the share of women is in general growing, but more rapidly after the policy and not before the policy in unregulated firms. And so far, we've shown you results for firms that are size 1 to 25 to make the firms on either side of the threshold more comparable. But now we extend to looking at firms of all sizes, right up to 1,000. And you see that the behavior we're reporting, which is a drop in female share of employment, is actually not significant after firm size of about 26. So it's the smaller firms, but not the firms strictly near the threshold. And the way I think of this, so the reason I think it's happening at size 20 is that every woman is a risk of a case. The reason I think it stops happening after, say, size 27 or somewhere in the sort of size distribution as you go up is that the larger firms can accommodate these costs. So we do have distributions on some of these hyperlinks of firm productivity, firm profits, and both are increasing with firm size. So the bigger firms are more able to kind of take the costs. Here, there's many interesting results here actually, but the one that's sticking out is again, baseline female share. So where the share of women was small, the decline in women is larger. And this is causing more segregation by gender, which is the stable predictor of sexual harassment. So the results here for female employment share that stick out are, as for the survey data, female share, but also low profits, which makes sense because we think what's happening is amongst firms that cannot take this additional burden. And the high unemployment rate, I guess it's easier to fire and it's easier to hire and make these changes. We did a robustness check using a fake policy that struck in 2010 rather than the actual in 2013. We used a placebo threshold where we set the size discontinuity at a size larger than 10. And we manually removed states where something else was going on in terms of policy change. And the results are all very stable. We then move, as promised, to supplement the firm panel data with cross-sectional data, it's all we have, that contain a representative sample of unregulated firms. And I am looking at the time, so I'm sorry, I'm now almost out of time. We repeat that analysis. We adjust the fixed effects somewhat to deal with the fact that it's a cross-section. And we get what look like larger results, but this is a different sample. And the percentage change, so I haven't actually been telling you the effect sizes. In the survey data, it was a 12% drop in female share. In the registered firm sector, it was a 4% drop. Now we get a dramatic 28% drop, which alarmed me. But look at this. This is because these unregulated firms that we brought in are predominantly very small. And the share of women is very small in small firms. So the share of women is 0.17. And so this becomes a very large percentage change. This is, okay, now a few words on firm size and I'll then wrap up. So this picture is not ours. It's from the paper I cited of Mike Gekta and Amrit Amirapu. It's using the economic census of India, which we cannot use because there isn't a post-policy census. So this is a pre-policy plot demonstrating the very clear discontinuity at size 10 in the data before the policy. This is our data from the registered sector, and it's showing you the post-policy in red and the pre-policy in blue. demonstrating a tendency for some bunching to the left of the threshold. So the red lies above the blue on the left, and the red lies below the blue on the right. And that is consistent with manipulation. This is exactly the same thing, but on a linear scale, and the pattern is maybe more clear, the bunching here. And this is our own, this is the full size distribution, where post is now blue. Yeah, sorry, we've switched color. Post is blue and pre is red. You see that firm size has changed, but that doesn't need to mean manipulation. To look at manipulation more clearly, we've taken the change in firm size and plotted it against firm size. So the second graph on the right-hand side, for example, that peak is telling you that most firms don't change size. And then we've zoomed in, just sort of narrowing the firm size range. So I think the most interesting graph is this third one, where the zoom in shows you an asymmetry with more bunching on the left and a sort of dip on the right. None of this is sort of, it's all heuristic. So we haven't got to make it more than heuristic, we need a model where we make some explicit assumptions that the reader can evaluate. And I'm going to say a few words about that in a second. Am I right that I should actually be wrapping up now? Yeah, so I'm not going to, so this is our attempt at quantifying, I'm really finished, at quantifying what I just showed you. So we plot, so we've got firm size on the left-hand side. These are firms of size 5 to 25. And the proportion of firms at each firm size is what this coefficient plots. And we show this to you pre-POSH and post-POSH. So pre-POSH, we see, sorry, I didn't say that these are changes. Everything is a change. So we see basically that firms are growing. The vertical line is 0. So if the dot lies to the right of the vertical line, the firms are growing. So at every firm size, the sector is growing. At every firm size in general, there's a change in the density. So the number of firms is growing. But there's a difference after POSH, which is there's a displacement to the left, which is a negative zone of firms of size 10 to 25. So this suggests that firms of size 10 to 25 there's less density there. There are fewer such firms. But this number, the proportion of such firms is about 1%. This is just this exact same picture showing you that all this manipulation or this behavior is at sizes under size 30. We looked at to understand what firms are doing and whether they use contract workers, whether they use shifts, and we find they do. We found no significant changes in wages or the wage gap. We found an increase in productivity and the wage bill and a fall in firm profits. Okay, I'm going to stop leaving on the slides. So I've mentioned before that we can estimate this counterfactual distribution, etc. And I'm going to shut up and leave these conclusions on the screen. Sorry for taking more time than I should.
Thank you so much, Sonia. So I'm going to take the question and start allowing people to talk. I had a couple of quick questions. So why do you think there's no adjustment on the wage? Like if there's no limit, wouldn't you think that you start paying women less? There was a little bit of a pre-trend on the extensive margin. Do you know where it comes from, or you know?
Yeah, that on the first thing about the wage, a quick answer I have, but it's quick and dirty, I'll tell you why, is that we do see, it's not precise, so I didn't show you those results. Where are they? Basically, I could show you in a second, I'm getting there, but the answer is that we do see a decline. So we see an increase in male wages, which is significant, and no increase in female wages. Putting those together, you'd expect an increase in the wage gap. But if you take them separately, the increase in male wages is consistent with hiring men rather than women. I don't know where I had those. Yeah, here we are. So if you take all firms in the sample, which I suggest you don't look at, it's misleading because many, many firms have no women. So the concept of a gender wage gap is not well defined. So if you look at panel B, these are the coefficients. They're bigger for men than for women. Everything is imprecise. But they are bigger for men than women, which coincides with my intuition. But the reason we put these results, which I think are actually important, is the same reason. I think we have a nice reduced form paper with one main result, but there is more to what is going on because we need an equilibrium model with supply changing. So if the supply, so very simply, the supply of women is increasing because the workplace has become safer for them. And in India, this could be really important. There are lots of educated women who could be in regulated firms, but the risk on the street, the risk in the workplace, they have the choice and they don't work. So the supply of women should increase. And for reasons we've discussed, the demand for women should decrease. And both forces should push the female wage down. But it appears not to be significant. My own hunch is that there's some important heterogeneity here, that the female and it's not the perfect frictionless market, because women are very, very unevenly distributed across sectors, occupations, and firms. So the statistic for the registered manufacturing sector, which of course is very special, it's a special case, is I think 70% of firms have no women. And that's the reason we always show you the extensive margin. Now, the extensive margin having a pre-trend, to be honest, I actually haven't noticed that. So maybe you can ask me there it is. So it has a pre-trend in the wrong direction. So it's unlikely to bias the results though. No? And it's also not significant. It's true that everything here is quite imprecise. Even the actual effect is not significant. These days I'm working a lot with Scandinavian data, and I always think the Indian data has such limited power. It's a big country with so many policies and so much going on, but we don't have the best data. So yeah, it's not precise, but I wouldn't worry a lot about that pre-trend.
Okay. And David Margolis had a question. David?
Yeah. Okay, yeah, thank you. And thanks very much, Sonia, for a super interesting talk. I was just wondering if there's any way that you can get at alternative employment opportunities for these women maybe in their local labor markets, because if the women have better outside options, maybe they're just more likely to quit when they're faced with harassment, and the ones who and just go somewhere else instead of filing a complaint where they could risk being some sort of retribution within the workplace. So do you have any way of getting at that?
So first, let me say that what you describe would be the baseline situation. So if they face sexual harassment, there was absolutely no policy to deal with it, no effective policy at the firm level even, then that describes the baseline, and we're focusing on the change after the policy. But still, your question is relevant. If they are displaced or not hired, where are they going? And we do have sort of lots of graphs in the appendix showing the sort of broader context, like what are the trends in female employment and which sectors and so on. In general, female participation is not falling, it's rising in firms. Female participation in the firm sector is rising. And most of the change it's not identified. The change associated with the timing of the act appears to be in unregulated small firms and self-employment rather than unemployment or non-participation. So it seems that women are joining the market in these sectors, but they're joining the least good firms with poor wages and poor benefits.
Thank you. Amy had a question. Amy, you can speak.
Hey, Sonia, thanks for the presentation. I have two questions. One is, is anything happening to firm exit? And then the second question is, you're seeing this hollowing out, women moving to smaller firms and bigger firms. And my question is, if they could have found a job in the bigger firm, why didn't they do so in the first place? Wouldn't those be better jobs, or is something about location or other things mattering? Thanks.
Thank you, Amy. So I think the answer to the second is because the workplace is now safer, and the big firms clearly are adopting the policy more comprehensively. So we know from some anecdotal work, and we've talked to some HR firms, we know that the bigger companies, definitely all the multinationals and big names like Tata, like the very big companies, are embracing the policy, making them more attractive than they used to be. So big firms become more attractive because they're compliant, and they're actually not just compliant, but taking it on board. Sorry, and Amy, you asked, so that was your kind of second question. Remind me what
firm exit, like how?
Yeah, firm exit. It's something we've thought of and not modeled. We have a panel, and we should model it, and it is important because it's sort of part of the control group. Yeah, it's a good point. We haven't modeled it.
Thank you, Amy. Gianmarco?
Yeah, so really cool stuff, Sonia. I was wondering if in the firm level data you have gender composition by ranks.
No.
And that would be super interesting because, well, first, if you have a female manager,
yeah,
probably protects you better. But also, I mean, the fact that they're firing women, it has to be costly for the firms at some point, right? And somewhat quantifying that trade-off, it could be super important.
Yeah. So you're right. The first thing you said, so because I started thinking of the second, I have the answer to the second. The first thing you said was this
female manager.
Huh?
Female manager.
Oh yeah. So this we sort of were wise to, and the annual survey of industries, the firm data, it provides gender for workers and not for supervisors. So we just don't have it. It's a real shame. But I've seen, I mean, what you're thinking is right. I've seen in, for example, the Brazil data that women who've suffered sexual harassment move into firms with female managers. And I think from memory, that's also what the paper by Abby Adams, Emily Nix, and so on is finding in their essay, their section.
Yeah, there's also a similar finding in one of Barbara Diaz's papers. Okay. And you don't have educational level by firm gender, no?
We not know in firms, Daksha, am I right? In the firm data, we don't have education, but in the survey data,
In the survey you do. No, because presumably it's easier to replace a non-educated worker than an educated worker, right? And that
yeah.
diving into that heterogeneity may give you some nice dynamics.
That may not necessarily be true in India. India, like the labor market in India is such that actually like unemployment amongst educated workers is in some places even higher than amongst uneducated workers, primarily because like the kind of jobs available are often more suitable for uneducated workers, and then people who are educated don't want to go into those jobs at all. So the labor market flexibility is very close in both those settings. So I'm not sure if that would hold true.
No, but there's got to be heterogeneity in the elasticity, no?
We have checked the educational heterogeneity, and we find the decline is higher for the lower educated workers. So yeah, it holds in our case. And so for that question, which was about the alternative employment opportunities, although this might not exactly answer it, but a person who is higher educated will have the skill to have more alternative employment opportunities. So while we find the effect the decline is higher for the person with lower other employment opportunities, I think it kind of explains that the effect is more on these people who have lower opportunities, other opportunities. It still doesn't exactly answer it, but yeah.
Thank you so much. So we are right on time. So thank you so much, Takesh, Medha, and Sonia, for a fantastic seminar, and see you in 2 weeks.
Okay, so I'm going to switch to this Zoom room, and also Daksha and Medha,
Yes.
where we can talk more. There was, I didn't really show, I was going to show Gianmarco. We plotted the productivity distribution change. Yeah, we're working on that idea, like how does it cost firms? And we have some non-parametrics to answer that question. We've done a lot of stuff that to show you would make the talk complicated. But your question is right. We need to think about what the firm is doing. My kind of hunch is that small firms that were already unproductive are manipulating size and composition, but the ones that are on a strong path are sort of carrying on and complying.
Interesting. Very interesting stuff. Thank you so much, Sonia.
And there was some like more educated woman, like maybe not all women suffer in the same way, no? Like maybe you keep the women that you feel are not going to complain, but the women that are more educated, or there could be some heterogeneity in type of like skills or type of employee that you hire.
Yeah, actually, this is why I think the model could be useful, because what you say is very right. It could go both ways. If you, in general, like in economics 101, you should get rid of the youngest, least skilled worker. But if you think that the educated woman is going to be a higher risk, you might want to get rid of her. So this is these are the graphs Medha was talking about. You do see what Gianmarco suggested. The clearer declines are for the less educated workers, the larger declines. Yeah. Oh.